We are apes, we are African apes.
Right.
If you want to believe that you survive death, or that humans do, when did it start in evolution, all that sort of question.
Sure.
It really doesn't make logical sense. But
does it always bring you back to that idea of then, so when did life begin, and does that make logical sense?
Well, you don't have to draw dividing lines. You can say
Right.
that the origin of life was a gradual process. You can say that the origin of life in the womb is a gradual process too, for that matter.
I meant more the origin of life at the beginning of life, yeah,
okay,
that original organization.
4 billion years ago or so, a little bit less maybe, the first self-replicating molecule came into existence. You could think of it as the first gene. It's hardly life,
Right.
but it provides the bedrock for natural selection to get going. Once you've got genes, you've got a possibility for natural selection.
Right.
And then it gradually builds structures for itself, which to begin with are rather simple, rather like bacteria, and then become more and more complex. And at some point they start getting nervous systems.
Right.
And at some later point they start getting a brain.
Yeah, this is the part that I remember from school, but
Yeah,
go back that up a little bit. That first part you said, where did that come from? Is there evidence of where that came from?
No,
That first.
not evidence, because it happened a long time ago under very different conditions.
Where did that come from? Is there evidence of where that came from?
No,
That first.
not evidence, because it happened a long time ago under very different conditions. There's lots of.
Is it just statistics? Is it chance?
Yes, actually, it probably is. It could have been a very improbable event. There's lots of.
Is it just statistics? Is it chance?
Yes, actually, it probably is. It could have been a very improbable event, and nobody knows that. Chemists are working on it, biologists are working on it, trying to think of ideas. But I doubt if we'll ever prove anything definite, because
Right.
it happened a very
Could they
long time ago.
has anyone come close to recreating that moment?
Not really, no. But sort of bits of it have been recreated. But it probably was a very improbable event. And another way of putting that is to ask the question: how likely is it that there's life on other planets? There are about 10 to the 22 stars. That's 1
So that's
22 noughts.
that's 19. What? 10 to the 22 is.
So that's.
So if it is a statistical anomaly, chances are that has been replicated in,
I think
in the
so.
universe.
It's highly likely that there are, I mean, even as few as 1 billion other planets might have life, and that's very, very few indeed when you compare that.
1 billion planets might have life.
I mean, that's a tiny number. 1 billion is a tiny number compared to 10 to the 22. So.
You think I don't know that? That's totally a tiny number compared to that.
So what I'm saying, if there are 1 billion planets that have life,
Right.
then they're probably so spaced out, they're probably so rare that the chance that any one of them will ever bump into any other is very low. Now there could be much more than 1 billion. It could be unique. It could be that life is only here,
Right.
and it would follow from that the origin of life on this planet was such a stupefyingly rare event that we're kind of wasting our time even thinking about how it happened.
Right. So if I say to you, don't do that to me. So if I say to you, you have faith that other life is out there, you're saying based on the evidence.
Well,
Statistical evidence that there are billions of planets, but isn't it still a hypothesis because we don't know how that first molecule got here?
we don't know. I mean, it's hardly even based on evidence. It's a statistical calculation.
Right.
It's a kind of plausibility calculation.
Right. This is so cool to think about.
Oh yeah.
Do you want to get high later?
Can you give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome?
Can you just stop when I think?
I'm recording.
Okay. There's a popular misunderstanding of evolution which says that fish turned into reptiles and reptiles turned into mammals, and so somehow we ought to
be able to look around the world today and look at our ancestors. We ought to be able to see the intermediates between fish and reptiles, or between reptiles and mammals. We ought to be able to see fish kind of on the way to becoming reptiles. But of course that's not the way it is at all. Fish are modern animals. They're just as modern as we are. They're descended from ancestors, which we're descended from. Way back 300 million years ago, there would have been an ancestor, which was the ancestor of modern fish and the ancestor of modern humans. And that ancestor, if you could have been there then, you could have seen the first steps towards a fish, say, coming out onto the land and becoming something like an amphibian. But that was a long time ago. You wouldn't expect to see that today. And so quite a lot of the misunderstanding of evolution, I suppose, stems from the fact that people are looking at modern animals and thinking that Darwin has said we're descended from them. Well, we're not. We're not descended from modern fish. We're not descended from modern monkeys. We're not descended from modern apes. They are modern animals just as we are. They're our cousins. They're not our ancestors.
I think that Darwin's theory is nonsense because everything has a beginning. So where did these cells originally come from? There must be a creator who created everything. So again, this is an issue that's often raised. How do you get around that debate about point of origin?
It's really rather silly, isn't it? Because it leaves open the question of where the creator came from. You haven't explained anything at all if you simply invoke a creator to say where did the first cells come from or where does the first atoms come from. That won't do that kind of explanation. Actually, it's much worse an explanation to say that there's a creator, because the creator would have to be a great, big, intelligent, complicated thing, which is the very kind of thing that we in science are trying to explain, and to a very large extent succeeding. Even without the Darwinian explanation, design is a very bad explanation for the complexity of life, because it's got a regression built into it. I mean, you have to explain the design error, and so it's not even a good explanation.
In order to recognize that an explanation is the best, you don't have to have an explanation of the explanation. In order to recognize that an explanation is the best, you don't have to be able to explain the explanation. Folks, this is an elementary point in the philosophy of science. Suppose astronauts were to find on the backside of the moon a pile of machinery there that had not been left by American or Russian cosmonauts. What would be the best explanation for that machinery? Well, clearly it would be some sort of extraterrestrial intelligence that had left the machinery there. And you don't have to have an explanation of who these extraterrestrials were or came from or how they got there or anything of that sort in order to recognize that the best explanation of this machinery is intelligent design. In order to recognize an explanation as the best, you don't have to have an explanation of the explanation. In fact, when you think about it, requiring that would immediately lead to an infinite regress of explanations. You would need an explanation of the explanation, but in order to recognize that as best, you need an explanation of the explanation of the explanation, and then an explanation of the explanation of the explanation of the explanation, and so that nothing could ever be explained.
One of the outdated philosophical cliches, in my opinion, is that, well, who created God? We hear that all the time, and they think it's a baseball bat against the theists. But it's made of sponge. And let me tell you why. If we say, what caused the cause that caused the universe, then let's continue. What caused the cause that caused the cause that caused the universe? Let's continue. Then what caused the cause that caused the cause that caused the cause that caused the universe? Let's carry on. Then what caused the cause that caused the cause that caused the cause that caused?
And that goes on and on and on backwards. But at one point, I have to have an uncaused cause, or there would be nothing in existence today. Think of a string of dominoes. you have a domino that knocks over a domino that knocks over a domino. I have to have a first domino, or that string of falling could never start.
So in essence, to claim who created God or what caused the cause of the universe is the equivalent of saying that we don't have a universe, that we don't have a universe.
Remember the premises of the argument I gave. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. Something cannot come into being out of nothing. But if something is eternal and timeless, then it doesn't fall under that first premise. It doesn't need a cause. And the concept of God is the concept of an eternal, self-existent, necessary being. And therefore the answer is simply that God is uncaused. He is
right, everybody now. We need y'all to stand tall, everybody now. Come on, all around the world singing M-U-S-L-I-M. I'm so blessed to be with M-U-S. Everybody now. Come on, I'm so blessed to be with M-U-S-L-I-M. I'm so blessed to be with them. Say M-U-S-L-I-M. Come on, I'm so blessed to be with them.
1 billion strong, all year long. Prayers to Allah, even in Hong Kong. Can never be wrong if we read the Quran, cause it's never been changed since day one. Others may brag, say that we lag, but they don't know all the power we had, the power we had, the power we have. So Muslim, don't you ever feel sad. Take many looks or read their books to see all the facts that your friends overlook. So always be proud, you can say it out loud. I'm proud to be down with the Muslim crowd.
M-U-S-L-I-M. Come on, I'm so blessed. Everybody now. Say M-U-S-L-I-M. I'm so blessed to be with them. Say M-U-S-L-I-M. I'm so blessed. Everybody now. Say M-U-S-L-I-M. Come on, yo. They look at me strangely, like I emit some type of energy that draws captors, disbelievers towards me, thinking to themselves what makes them different than me. Is it the hair, the clothes, or maybe the food he eats? What could it be that makes the cat stand at attention? His demeanor's peaceful, and on his face is clearly written that this ain't the sort of brother caught up in this and that, running streets, carrying heat, yo, he ain't into that. This brother must live by some type of criteria that make him to the average cat quite superior. So maybe one of these days I get near enough to the Nancy Drew and this mystery and clear it up. So listen up if you think this is strange, cause he's the type of those that used to run the new Shahada brain. And I've been witness to the one with 99 names, inshallah, I will always remain. Come on. Yeah. I'm so blessed to be with M-U-S-L-I-M. I'm so blessed to be with M-U-S-L-I-M. I'm so blessed to be with M-U-S-L-I-M. Everybody
Don't know about you, I know about me. I'm proud to be rolling Islamically everywhere I see, even on TV. People talking trash about the way I be, but what they all hate is if we get weight. They know we're the ones with our heads on straight. Don't ever frown with your head looking down. If you read the Quran, you're the best in the town. Y'all have doubts, say we have no clout, but within a few years, see how we've come about. We're back on the scene, the #1 dean. I'm proud to be down with the Muslim League.
Step it up, y'all. Around the world now. Come on. To be with them, y'all. Right now. Come on. Around the world. To be with them, come on. I'm bring it on. To be with them, say M-U-S-L-I-M. I'm so blessed to be with them.
ADC and Maryland, you know we be with them. Come on now, from Philly to Jersey, up to New York, you know we be with them. LA, UK, and Dubai, you know we be with them. Come on y'all, Detroit, San Fran, and Dar es Salaam, yes, you know we be with them. With the globe, there goes Turkey and Germany, yeah, you know we be with them. Check it out, Elfos, Joburg, and Canada, you know we be with them. I'm talking about Kuwait, Jeddah, and Florida, you know we be with them. Where the Muslims at? Morocco, Glasgow, Cairo, Bamako, you know we be with them. Right, Pakistan, Qatar, and Zanzibar, you know we be with them. Check it out, y'all, from Malaysia to Palestine, India, Sudan, we be with them. We be with them. We be with them. We be with them.
M-U-S-L-I-M. Come on. I'm so blessed. Everybody now. Say M-U-S-L-I-M. I'm so blessed to be with them. Say
You happy with that? Sorry, yeah. Gentleman over here in the green.
It's the question about the meaning of life, really. Coming back to that, does science give the answer? I think is the question, really. And like a scientist, Nobel Prize-winning scientist like Peter Meadow would say that the question why are we here can't be answered by science. And I don't understand how we can say with such confidence that it can.
Well, what I would say about the question why is, why do you think you have any right to ask it? It's not a meaningful question, except unless you specify the kind of answer you're expecting. As a biologist, it's very easy to answer the question, why do birds have wings, for example? I mean, we can do that in Darwinian terms. If you say, however, why do mountains exist? There are some questions which simply don't deserve an answer. I mean, the question, why do mountains exist? You can give an answer in terms of the geological processes that give rise to mountains, but that's not what you want, is it? You want something about the purpose of mountains. What is the purpose of a mountain? It's a silly question. Doesn't deserve an answer. The mere fact that you can ask a question, the mere fact that you can frame a question in the English language doesn't mean that it's entitled to an answer. If I say to you, what is the color of jealousy? It's a perfectly grammatical English sentence, but it's not a question that deserves an answer. The correct answer is, don't ask such a silly question.
But is it not part of the human condition to ask these questions?
It may well be part of the human condition to ask silly questions, yes.
But maybe that's why people turn to religion, is to find that answer.
Destroyed by Darwin, and Darwin, of course, doesn't explain the origin of the universe. For that, I invoke the anthropic principle and the multiverse. Less satisfying, admittedly, but science makes progress. The one thing you can be absolutely sure is that a creative designer cannot be a satisfying explanation.
Dr. Lennox.
The anthropic principle, as you stated, Richard, I think is a complete truism. Of course we have to be on such and such a kind of planet of the kind that we could appear on. That does not answer the question how we came to exist on it. And I fear I have to disagree with you on Darwinism. Darwinism does not explain life. It may explain certain things about what happens when you've got life. But evolution assumes the existence of a mutating replicator. It does not explain how that replicator came to exist in the first place. Now that's a major discussion. I want to address the who designed the designer question, because it's the old schoolboy question, who created God? I'm actually very surprised to find it as a central argument in your book, because it assumes that God is created. And I'm not surprised, therefore, that you call the book The God Delusion, because created gods are by definition a delusion. Now, I know, and I ought to explain, that Richard doesn't like people who say to him that they don't believe in the God he doesn't believe in. But I think that this is possibly touching a sore spot, because you leave yourself wide open to the charge. After all, you are arguing that God is a delusion. And in order to weigh your argument, I said that it is you who's arguing that God is a delusion.
Oh, sorry. All right.
And in order to weigh that argument, I need to know what you mean by God. And if you say, if there is a God, you have to ask who created God, that means that you're reduced to thinking about created gods. Well, none of us believe in created gods, Jews, Muslims, or Christians. And I think that argument then is entirely beside the point, and perhaps you ought to put it on your shelf marked celestial teapots where it belongs. The God who created the universe, ladies and gentlemen, was not created. He is eternal.
When you make a value judgment, don't you immediately step yourself outside of this evolutionary process and say there is the reason this is good is because it's good, and you don't have any way to stand on that statement?
But my value judgment itself could come from my evolutionary past, and I suppose...
So therefore it's just as random in a sense as any product of evolution.
Well, you could say that, but it doesn't in any case, nothing about it makes it more probable that there is anything supernatural.
Okay, but ultimately, your belief that rape is wrong is as arbitrary as the fact that we've evolved 5 fingers rather than 6. I mean,
you could say that, yeah.
Yeah.
Welcome to the Casino of Life. Who wants to spin for a chance to win?
Oh, sure. I'll give it a shot. What do I win?
Take a look at this.
Huh? How about the world's first single-cell organism? This perfectly aligned string of proteins could be yours.
Now, take a spin.
I won.
Tina, tell him how many times he needs to do that to win the prize.
250.
That's right, folks, and all in the correct order.
But that's impossible.
We've heard that before, haven't we, Richard?
Come on, Mother Nature, do your thing. You stupid machine! I hate you!
So what is the ultimate meaning of life for you?
The ultimate meaning of life depends on what you mean by it, obviously. Each one of us can make an ultimate meaning. Each one of us can have a private meaning, a purpose in our life, what we hope to achieve in our life. Or a biologist might say the ultimate meaning of life is the propagation of genes. That would be a very different kind of meaning, and they're both true.
I'm getting the message that it's ridiculous for me to believe in a God who created the universe and me, because I have to ask who created God. All I'm doing is turning that question round and saying, the universe, you admit, created you because there's nothing else. Well, then who created it?
I understand you perfectly. I'm making that we both of us are faced with the problem of saying, how did things start?
Yes.
I'm saying it's a hell of a lot easier to start with something simple than to start with something complex. That's what complex means.
But I don't think so. If I pick up a book called The God Delusion, it's a pretty sophisticated book. It's got lots of words in it. But actually, as I look at page 1, I don't even need to go beyond page 1. I conclude that it comes from something more complex than that book itself, namely you.
Yes. I mean, obviously, complex things exist, and brains exist.
Well,
and
why can I not look at the universe, the whole show, which includes Dawkins and Lennox?
I'll tell you why. Because my brain that produced a book has an explanation in its own right. That explanation is evolution. We go back and back and back to the origin of the universe. That provides an explanation for complex brains, and complex brains produce books and museums and cars and computers. Of course we have complex things that produce other complex things. But science has an explanation for where complex brains come from in terms of simple beginnings.
I don't think it has at all. At the level of the origin of life, reading the literature, even the recent literature, the word miracle comes up probably far too often for your liking anyway, that they're just going from, say, the self-organizational properties of low-level molecules that you got in some kind of primeval situation to the phenomenal self-organizational potentialities of macromolecules. There's just no way you can get there.
Well, you're asserting that there's no way. We don't yet know what it is because there's a lot of work yet to be done. Science doesn't yet know everything. There are still gaps.
Yeah. So what is the ultimate meaning of life for you?
The ultimate meaning of life depends on what you mean by it, obviously. Each one of us can make an ultimate meaning. Each one of us can have a private meaning, a purpose in our life, what we hope to achieve in our life. Or a biologist might say the ultimate meaning of life is the propagation of genes. That would be a very different kind of meaning, and they're both true.
I asked Richard whether he started life, as indeed I had, without a religious thought.
No, I had a normal Anglican upbringing, and I think I first started to doubt it when I woke up to the fact that there were lots of different religions and they couldn't all be right, and it was just an accident, an arbitrary accident, that I happened to have been brought up in the
Anglican Church. So that caused me to have doubts, and I sort of became a non-believer at the age of about 9 as a result of that. However, I then reverted to religious belief until the age of about 16.
Okay, well, if I can stop you there
Yes.
and say, I'm very interested in these critical moments.
Yes.
What do you think prompted the reversion to something which you had begun to be doubtful about?
I think it was the argument from design. I think I started to appreciate the glorious complexity, especially of life, and didn't at that time understand the Darwinian explanation for it. And so I think that I did the rather naive thing of assuming that if something looks as though it's designed, it probably is designed, and didn't kind of wake up to the alternative explanation until I was about 16. Also didn't wake up to the fact that even without the Darwinian explanation, design is a very bad explanation for the complexity of life, because it's got a regression built into it. I mean, you have to explain the design error, and so it's not even a good explanation. But finally, I was about 16 when I discovered Darwinism, and was taught Darwinism, and then realized that there is not just an adequate explanation for the complexity of life, but a wonderful, sort of electrifyingly simple explanation, which is the Darwinian evolution.
It's a matter, you can quickly respond to that.
You can dispute exactly what's meant by nothing, but whatever it is, it's very, very simple. And why is that funny?
Well, I think it's a bit funny to be trying to define nothing.
Well, can I put that to you as a question?
I would be in favour of infanticide. So if a baby was 1 year old and turned out to have some horrible, incurable disease that meant it was going to die in agony in later life, what about infanticide? Strictly morally, I can see no objection to that at all. I would be in favour of infanticide.
But you're saying they're not Christians, even if they think of themselves as Christian. You know what they are, even though they tell you.
I'm not presenting my opinion here. This press release is offered to people to look down it and say, look, these people who call themselves Christians actually don't read the Bible, don't go to church, don't believe Jesus was the Son of God, don't even know what the first book of the New Testament is.
But Richard,
it's up to you to make up your mind whether you think they're Christian. Don't ask me. My opinion is not relevant.
Richard, if I said to you, what is the full title of The Origin of Species? I'm sure you could tell me that.
Yes, I could.
Go on then.
On The Origin of Species, on The Origin of Species, there is a subtitle with respect to the preservation of favoured races in the fight, in the struggle for
You're
life.
the high pope of Darwinism.
Not bad,
and
I'd give him some just...
But if you asked people who believed in evolution,
what that question, and then you came back and said 2% got it right, it would be terribly easy for me to go, they don't really believe it after all. It's just not fair to ask people these questions. They self-identify as Christians, and I think you should respect that.
If you could ask Richard Dawkins one question, what would it be?
Institutions discovered that actually that 98% that people thought was junk isn't junk at all. It's absolutely essential for the maintenance of life.
Fascinating fact that the chief rabbi has, the evidence he's given, that whereas we thought that only a minority of the genome was doing something, namely that minority which actually codes for protein, and now we find that actually the majority of it's doing something. What it's doing is calling into action the protein coding genes. So you can think of the protein coding genes as being the sort of toolbox of subroutines, which is pretty much common to all mammals. I mean, all mice and men have the same number, roughly speaking, of protein coding genes, and that's always been a bit of a blow to the self-esteem. I have noticed that there are some creationists who are jumping on it because they think that's awkward for Darwinism. Quite the contrary, of course. It's exactly what a Darwinist would hope for.
If you take genes that are no longer functional, that are just vestigial, they're not doing anything, and even pseudogenes that don't do anything but are vestigial relics of genes that once did something. Now, this is massive, massive, massive quantities of evidence left lying around the earth in every species of creature that's ever been looked at, is carrying around massive quantities of evidence in the DNA. It's like fragments of a document on your hard disk which are no longer being used. They're no longer on the directory, so you no longer see them. Creationists who are jumping on it because they think that's awkward for Darwinism is the traces, the remains. You see the consequences of the evolutionary process. And you find that it forms a perfect branching hierarchy. It's a tree. And what else could that tree be but a family tree? You find that they form a perfect hierarchical pattern. It's a family tree. And plot out the resemblances and they fall on a perfect hierarchy, a perfect family.
It's the last question.
Professor Dawkins, as an atheist, is it not the case that you either believe in the universe just popping into existence without a cause, which is worse than hocus pocus, or in this thing called the multiverse, which has as much independent empirical evidence as Hades controlling the underworld?
Right. The phraseology you use is somewhat biased, somewhat slanted. The universe popping into existence out of nothing, the multiverse theory is used in this context to explain the fact that some physicists believe that the physical constants are too finely adjusted. It's as though it's a put-up job. It looks as though the physical constants are so finely adjusted that if you change any one of them, then the universe would collapse. And I started to say that. Yes. Now, the multiverse hypothesis is a kind of Darwinian way of solving that. There are billions and billions of universes, all of which have different settings of their fundamental constants. A tiny minority of those billions and billions of universes have their constants set in such a way as to give rise to a universe which lasts long enough to give rise to galaxies, stars, planets, chemistry, and hence the process of evolution.
But do you understand, it does make me chuckle that you mock me for believing in a prophet that flies into a heaven, but you believe in lots and lots of universes that you can't show me, prove to me, test to me in a lab, as a basis of getting out of believing in a God and a prophet.
I'm astonished that you should compare the two.
I'm comparing the lack of evidence for the two.
Well, you cannot use your own intuitive common sense in order to diss physics. I mean, if you could do that, we wouldn't need physicists. I mean, they are very sophisticated people. They do mathematics.
But there are physicists like Paul Davies who have dissed the multiverse theory as being nonsense.
Well, Paul Davies would rather... It's
a matter, you can quickly respond to that.
You can dispute exactly what's meant by nothing, but whatever it is, it's very, very simple. And why is that funny?
Well, I think it's a bit funny to be trying to define nothing.
Well, can I put that to you as a question?